The European countryside was a picture of peace. Rolling hills, a vibrant green, stretched as far as the eye could see. John Wick was behind the wheel of his SUV. His wife, Eleanor, sat beside him. Their 3 children chatted happily in the back seat. Eleanor turned to John, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "This was a good idea, John," she said. John smiled, a rare sight. "Almost, sweetheart," he said, her innocent smile warming his heart. John slowed the car as they approached the bridge. The river sparkled below, its water crystal clear. A wave of nostalgia washed over John. He pushed them aside. His focus returned to the present. They were halfway across the bridge when a shiver ran down John's spine. "Elena, take the kids," he whispered, his voice urgent, "but something's not right." The roar of engines shattered the peaceful silence. 3 black SUVs blocked their path. John's heart lurched in his chest. "Get down!" he roared. A deafening barrage of gunfire erupted. Eleanor screamed, shielding their children. He had to get them out of this, but how? The river? The SUV teetered on the edge before plunging into the icy depths below. The SUV hit the water with a deafening crash. Disoriented, he struggled to free himself. His ears pounded, his vision blurred. But one thought cut through the chaos: his family. He thrashed, kicked, and finally broke free. He surfaced, gasping for air. "Elena!" he screamed, but his words were swallowed by the roar of the water. He spotted a flash of color beneath the surface, and then he saw her. Eleanor. Her lifeless hand reached out from the shattered window. His heart seized in his chest. He swam towards her, driven by desperate hope. He pulled, but she wouldn't budge. He pulled her free and kicked for the surface. He reached the riverbank and collapsed, Elena's lifeless body beside him, but there was nothing. She was gone. The children were gone. A sob escaped his lips. He couldn't stay here. He had to move, had to disappear. John forced himself to his feet. "I'll make them pay," he whispered. The Baba Yaga was back. Berlin, a city of shadows and secrets. John Wick knew this city intimately. He found himself drawn to the Berlin homeless shelter. It was a sanctuary for a different breed of lost souls. John walked through the shelter's doors, his arrival unnoticed. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar faces. He was here for information. The Raven. A whisper in the shadows. John had crossed paths with the Raven once before. The Raven's nest was an abandoned warehouse on the docks. John arrived as the sky began to bleed into hues of orange and purple. The warehouse door creaked open. John moved through the labyrinthine corridors. The light led him to a small office. "John Wick," the Raven's voice cut through the silence. "You seek information." John said nothing. "The Pookah," John finally said. "Tell me what you know. The Pookah is not an organization you want to be entangled with, John." "I don't have a choice," John said. "The price of truth, John, is often paid in blood." John's blood ran cold. The Pookah. An organization so secretive, so ruthless, that most considered them a myth, but John knew better. "The Pookah," John repeated. "They have been active again, John." "Who?" John demanded. "But you know who to ask," John pressed. The Raven sighed, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had settled upon them. "There is someone," he conceded, his voice barely a whisper. "A man who might have the answers you seek." "Who?" John demanded again, his patience wearing thin. "Viktor Orlov," the Raven said, his gaze meeting John's once more. He was once a high-ranking member of the Pookah, but he had a falling out with the organization. Now he operates on his own, a dealer in information and other, less savory commodities. John felt a jolt of recognition. The name sparked a memory buried deep in the recesses of his mind. Viktor Orlov. He had encountered him once, years ago, during his previous life. Orlov was a ruthless operator, a man who valued loyalty and discretion above all else, and he had a long memory. "Where can I find him?" John asked, his voice devoid of emotion. The raven reached into his pocket and produced a small silver locket. He tossed it to John, who caught it reflexively. "This will lead you to him," the raven said, a cryptic smile playing at the corners of his lips. John examined the locket. It was cold and heavy in his hand, the metal smooth against his calloused fingers. He flipped it over, his eyes drawn to the intricate engraving of a raven, its eye a single blood-red ruby that seemed to pulse with an inner light. "Be careful, John," the raven warned, his voice low and serious. "Orlov is not someone you want to cross, and if he is involved with the Pookah, then you are walking into a viper's nest. Turn back now while you still can." But John was already shaking his head. He slipped the locket into his pocket, the metal a cold reminder of the task at hand. He had come too far, lost too much to turn back now. He had to know the truth. He had to find the people who were responsible for Elena's death and the deaths of their children. "I appreciate the warning," John said, his voice flat. But his eyes, cold and hard as steel, betrayed his resolve. He was going to find Orlov, and he was going to get his answers, no matter the cost. He turned and walked towards the door, leaving the raven standing in the shadows of his office. As he stepped back out into the night, the sounds of the city washing over him, John knew there was no turning back. He had started down a path paved with blood and vengeance, and he would not rest until he had reached its end. The locket pulsed with a cold, heavy weight in John's hand. It was more than just a trinket, it was a key, a guide to the next step on his path of vengeance. Berlin throbbed around him, a living organism of neon and concrete. But John was immune to the city's intoxicating chaos. His focus was laser-sharp, honed by grief and fueled by rage. The address the raven had given him was a nightclub. It was the kind of place where shadows danced with the living. John moved through the crowd like a phantom, his eyes constantly scanning. He spotted Orlov's bodyguard first. Section 2, The Hunt. John's blood turned to ice. He knew that getting to Orlov wouldn't be easy. The man was too smart, too cautious, surrounded by layers of protection. John studied the bodyguard, searching for any weakness. But the man was a professional. It would take more than brute force. John's eyes darted around the room. He spotted a service corridor. It was his only shot. He needed a distraction. His eyes fell on a group of men. One of them was bragging loudly. John bumped into the man, sending his drink flying. The man roared in anger. The bodyguard turned his head. John slipped past the bodyguard. He melted into the shadows of the service corridor. Section 3, Whispers in the Dark. John moved swiftly, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. He was in another world now, a world of shadows and secrets. He reached the end of the corridor and faced a steel door, its paint chipped and peeling. He pressed his ear against the cold metal, listening intently. He tried the doorknob. Locked. Above the door, he spotted a small barred window. John reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved the silver locket. He raised the locket and smashed it against the glass. He reached through the broken window and unlatched the lock. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. Viktor Orlov sat at the table, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. His eyes were sharp, his gaze unwavering. "John Wick," he said, his voice smooth as silk. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Section 1, Face Off. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. John stood silently, his eyes locked on Orlov. Orlov, for his part, seemed unfazed by John's sudden appearance, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly against the sides. The only sound in the otherwise silent room. "So, the Baba Yaga graces me with his presence," Orlov finally said, taking a slow sip of his drink. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" John didn't bother with pleasantries. "You know why I'm here, Orlov," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Orlov chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Always so direct, John. It was one of your more endearing qualities." He set down his glass, the amusement fading from his eyes. "But I'm afraid you're barking up the wrong tree. I haven't had the pleasure of working with the Pookah for quite some time." John took a step closer, his hands clenching into fists. "Don't lie to me," he snarled. "I know you're still connected to them, and I know you know who ordered the hit on my family." Orlov sighed, leaning back in his chair. You were always a persistent one, John, a trait I both admired and loathed. He paused, his gaze meeting John's. But even if I knew something, which I don't, why would I tell you? John didn't hesitate. He lashed out, his fist connecting with Orlov's jaw with a sickening crunch. Orlov cried out, more in surprise than pain, and toppled backward, his chair crashing to the floor. John stood over him, his chest heaving, his anger a living thing inside him. I'm not playing games, Orlov, he growled. Tell me what I want to know, or so help me. God, I will tear you apart. Orlov chuckled, a thin stream of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He spat out a tooth, his eyes hardening as he looked up at John. You think you can scare me, John? He rasped. You're nothing but a pawn, just like the rest of us. The Pookah owns us all. John's rage threatened to boil over. He grabbed Orlov by the collar, hauling him to his feet. Who? He roared, shaking him violently. Who's pulling the strings? Orlov laughed, a harsh grating sound. You'll never find him, he gasped. He's a ghost, a shadow. He exists only in whispers and rumors. Even those who serve him have never looked upon his face. John slammed Orlov against the wall, the force of the impact knocking the wind out of him. What's his name? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Orlov coughed, his breath rattling in his chest. He is the serpent, he wheezed, and he is everywhere and nowhere. John stared at him for a moment, his mind racing. The serpent, it was a name he'd never heard before, but the way Orlov spoke it, with a mixture of fear and reverence, told him everything he needed to know. He let go of Orlov, who slumped to the floor, gasping for air. John knew he wouldn't get anything more out of him. Not tonight. He turned and walked towards the door, his mind already working on his next move. He's right, you know, Orlov said, his voice weak but steady. John paused, his hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him. Orlov was watching him, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and resignation. The serpent is not someone you can just find, Orlov continued. He controls everything, sees everything. He's always one step ahead. You're walking into a war you can't win, John. John met his gaze, his expression unreadable. He didn't need Orlov to tell him how dangerous this was. He knew better than anyone the depths of the Pookah's reach, their ruthlessness, their ability to operate with impunity. But he didn't care. They had taken everything from him, his wife, his children, his life. He had nothing left to lose. Maybe, John finally said, his voice low and steady, but he's going to know I'm coming for him. And with that he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Orlov lying on the floor, his words echoing in the silence. John had a new target now, a new purpose. He would find the serpent, and he would have his revenge. He didn't know how or when, but he would find him. The serpent had made a grave mistake when he crossed John Wick. He had awakened a beast, and the hunt was on. Berlin, a city of shadows and whispers, of secrets, buried deep beneath layers of history and concrete. The perfect place to disappear, the perfect place to hunt. John Wick walked the rain-slicked streets, his trench coat pulled tight against the biting wind. He had no destination, only the burning need for vengeance. The city lights blurred around him, a kaleidoscope of colors reflecting in the puddles at his feet. He felt detached, a ghost moving through a world that no longer held any meaning for him. The locket, cold and heavy, pressed against his chest, a constant reminder of his purpose. The serpent, the name echoed in the silence of his mind, a whisper of power and menace. He knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but fear was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had stared death in the face and emerged from the abyss. He was John Wick, the Baba Yaga, and he would not rest until he had found the man who had taken everything from him. Two figures, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoodies, lounged against the opposite wall, cigarettes dangling from their lips. They straightened as John approached, their hands disappearing into their pockets. "You lost, mate?" one of them asked, his voice thick with a German accent. John said nothing. He continued to walk towards them, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. The two men exchanged nervous glances. They had misjudged him. They could sense it now. The aura of danger that clung to him like a shroud. "This is a bad neighborhood," the second man said, his voice tight with apprehension. "You should turn around." John stopped a few feet away from them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket, letting it dangle from his fingers. The flickering streetlight glinted off the ruby eye of the engraved raven. "I'm looking for someone," John said, his voice low and dangerous, the words barely a whisper in the stillness of the alleyway. "A man who calls himself the Serpent." The two men froze, their eyes widening in recognition. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Even in the darkest corners of the city, the Serpent's reputation preceded him. We don't know anything," one of them stammered, his voice barely audible. John's lips curled into a humorless smile. "You're lying," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "But that's all right, I'm used to it." He took a step closer, the locket swinging gently from his hand, a pendulum counting down the seconds until all hell broke loose. The hunt had begun.